Dear audience friends, welcome to my channel. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Let's get started.
I am a 19-year-old girl named Daniela, navigating the chaotic world of college as I pursue my dream of becoming a doctor. My life is ordinary, without any extravagant luxuries or dramatic events, but it still manages to keep me on my toes. My daily routine consists of attending classes, taking notes, studying, and occasionally enjoying parties with my friends. I share a small yet cozy apartment with my boyfriend, along with our mischievous cat and a mountain of books. I am one of those people who adores the smell of rain and the comforting feeling of being wrapped in a blanket on cold nights. Although I am not an expert in love, I met Lucas, a 30-year-old man who works in marketing, about a year ago. We unexpectedly crossed paths in a store, and since then, we have been together. Lucas is a kind and attentive person who always supports me in my studies and ensures that I have everything I need. He often feels like my protector, making me feel safe in this world that I am still exploring. Although his jokes can sometimes be a bit heavy-handed and make me angry, I know it's his way of bringing a smile to my face. Our relationship is comfortable, and while we haven't discussed long-term plans yet, it's comforting to have someone to rely on. Some may argue that I am too young to be in a serious relationship, but I genuinely don't care about their opinions. What matters is that we get along, share laughter and concerns, and that brings me happiness. College life is a whole new world, but I have Lucas by my side, pushing me forward when things get tough. Balancing classes, homework, and personal time can be challenging, but we always manage to make it work. We spend evenings together watching movies in our apartment, exploring new dining places, and occasionally going out with friends to maintain a balanced social life. I'm not sure if it's fate or just a fortunate coincidence, but Lucas has consistently been a source of support for me. Although I sometimes wonder if I'm missing out on something at this stage of my life, being with him genuinely makes me happy. I may not be an expert in love, but the connection I share with Lucas feels genuine, devoid of any unnecessary drama or cheesiness. It's a comforting bond that aligns perfectly with who I am. So, this is my life, a blend of books, coffee, laughter, and the presence of a charming guy who always brings me my favorite hot chocolate. It's a simple existence that brings me happiness. What more could I ask for? However, as I mentioned earlier, the college world is full of surprises, and one of them unexpectedly came my way. College life can be chaotic, and I was not exempt from its challenges. On a seemingly ordinary day, burdened with an overwhelming load of exams and homework, I found myself exhausted. To my dismay, despite my dedication, my grades did not reflect my efforts. They weren't terrible, but they certainly fell short of my expectations. The prospect of repeating the semester terrified me, as it would divert me from my intended path, which I was unwilling to accept. I knew I had to take action, and quickly. Amidst my frustration, an idea began to form in my mind, a rather stomach-churning idea. The thought of seducing my professor to improve my grades crossed my mind. I had no experience in flirting, and I wasn't even sure if it would work, but my desperation and wounded pride led me to seriously consider it. And so, armed with an unusual determination, I found myself in Professor Garcia's office. He was a middle-aged man with a serious demeanor and a reputation for being strict but fair. Nervously, I entered his office, feigning confidence. I explained my situation, expressing my struggles with grades, despite my dedication. As I spoke, I could feel his scrutinizing gaze, and in that moment, I realized the madness of my plan. However, I was resolute. I had come this far, and there was no turning back. Professor Garcia listened attentively, his dark eyes seemingly searching for something in mine. He spoke about the importance of hard work and responsibility, and every word he said was undeniably true. Yet, my mind was fixated on a different matter. Would my attempt at flirting with him yield the desired results? Could I persuade him to change my grades? It was a treacherous path, and I wasn't certain if I was willing to cross that line. Finally, Professor Garcia sighed and appeared to contemplate my request. The tension in the air was palpable as I anxiously awaited his response. Unexpectedly, he suggested that I could undertake an additional project to improve my grades. There was no indication that I needed to do anything beyond academic work. It was evident that Professor Garcia possessed integrity and was unwilling to succumb to my manipulations. On one hand, I felt relieved, but on the other, I was embarrassed that I had even entertained the idea of using my charms to achieve my goals. I left his office with my head held low, consumed by frustration. Although I hadn't crossed the line, I knew I had come dangerously close, willing to betray the trust of both my boyfriend and myself just to improve my grades. Days passed, and the proposal Professor Garcia had made remained my only option for raising my grades. Despite abandoning my foolish plan to seduce him, the situation remained tense. Every time I entered his class, a blush would creep onto my cheeks. I couldn't help but think about how close I had come to crossing that line in my pursuit of better grades. Gradually, our conversations about the additional project became more frequent. While strictly academic in nature, I couldn't ignore the subtle change in Professor Garcia's demeanor. Sometimes, our gazes would linger longer than necessary. I couldn't be certain if I was imagining things, but it seemed as though his attitude towards me had shifted since that day in his office. During one of our classes, after discussing the project, Professor Garcia approached me and asked an unexpected question. "Daniela, have you ever considered exploring interests beyond medicine? I mean, have you thought about other areas or passions?" His question was not inappropriate, but the way he said it and the way he looked at me made me uncomfortable. I responded with a shrug and a nervous smile. "Not much, medicine is currently my main focus." My voice sounded louder than expected in the silence of the classroom. Professor Garcia nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on me, as if searching for something more. Our classes continued, and each time I was in his presence, I could feel his gaze and attention charged with desire that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just my imagination, there had undeniably been a change in his attitude towards me. However, despite his behavior occasionally crossing boundaries, he was still my teacher, and I had Lucas, someone who had been by my side, supporting and helping me with every little thing I needed. Over time, our conversations about the project became more personal. Professor Garcia would share anecdotes from his youth, his travels, and his experiences, extending beyond the realm of medicine and revealing a different side of himself. In turn, I also shared aspects of my life, my aspirations to become a doctor, and my dreams of exploring the world. I must admit, I enjoyed these conversations as they provided an escape from my academic worries and the monotony of daily life. Deep down, however, I knew that these conversations were part of my plan to boost my grades. Although our discussions never explicitly crossed any boundaries, I was aware that I was treading on dangerous ground. One day, after class, Professor Garcia stopped me before I could gather my belongings. "Daniela, can I speak with you for a moment?" His voice was soft, but carried an indescribable undertone. I nodded and followed him out of the classroom, my mind racing with various thoughts. We stood in the hallway, away from prying eyes. Professor Garcia appeared calm, but there was something in his expression that I couldn't decipher. "Daniela, I wanted to discuss the project I proposed to you," he began, his dark eyes fixed on mine. I nodded, attempting to maintain composure, despite the nerves fluttering in my stomach. "Of course, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to improve my grades," I replied, trying to sound confident. He smiled, but there was a hint of something more in his smile. "I'm glad to hear that, Daniela. I believe it would be beneficial if we worked together on the subjects you find most challenging." He moved closer, and his tone subtly changed. His comment caught me off guard, but I tried to remain composed. "That sounds like a great idea. I appreciate your assistance," I responded sincerely, yet aware of the tension in the air. Garcia tilted his head, his gaze fixed on me. "You know, Daniela, I enjoy working with dedicated students. I'm willing to go the extra mile to ensure your success." His gaze intensified, and the atmosphere shifted. My thoughts raced as I attempted to decipher his words. There seemed to be a double entendre, something beyond academics. Was he implying something more? Or was he merely being polite in his choice of words? I decided to seize the opportunity. He was willing to help me improve my grades, and I was willing to do whatever it took. Thank you, Professor. Your support means a lot to me, I replied, attempting to sound firm yet playful. He smiled again, this time with a hint of complicity. I'm sure we'll find ways to work together, Daniela. Not only in your studies, but in other aspects of your life as well. His gaze lingered, and his expression became suggestive. At that moment, I understood. There was innuendo in his words, and I was willing to exploit the situation to my advantage. If I could use his interest to improve my grades, why not? I responded with a playful smile. I'd be delighted to collaborate on anything that could enhance my academic performance. My words carried a double meaning, and we both knew it. His smile widened, and his gaze grew more intense. That's what I like to hear, Daniela. And I'm certain we'll find opportunities to discuss this further outside of class. There was an invitation in his tone, an opportunity one was willing to seize. He had understood my intentions, and I was willing to utilize the situation to achieve my goals. After all, I would have been willing to do far worse to improve my grades. So, what do you suggest? I asked, my words dripping with innuendo. He leaned closer, and I could feel his breath against my ear as he responded, his voice soft but suggestive. You could come to my house outside of school hours. We could work on the subjects you need to reinforce in a more relaxed setting. Her voice was filled with suggestion. I knew exactly what she meant, and I was willing to comply. Not for him, but for myself and my goal of improving my grades. That sounds like an excellent idea. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to succeed in my studies, I replied, my voice carrying a double entendre. We concluded the conversation with shared smiles, a complicity that had crossed a dangerous line. I was determined to do whatever it took to achieve my goals, even if it meant taking advantage of a situation I knew was wrong. The game had begun, and I was willing to play it until the end. The following week, the day I had arranged with Professor Garcia arrived sooner than expected. I was determined to follow through with my plan, even though I knew I was entering dangerous territory. After class, as my classmates dispersed, I discreetly pulled out my phone and sent a text to Lucas, my boyfriend. Hey sweetie, just wanted to let you know that I'll be staying a little late at the university today. We're working on a project with the girls. Don't worry, I'll be home once we're done. Kisses. It wasn't the first time I had fabricated an excuse to stay at the university a little longer, so I didn't anticipate any suspicion. I put my phone away and headed towards the meeting point Professor Garcia and I had agreed upon, a location where we wouldn't risk being seen by acquaintances. I walked with a confident stride, attempting to ignore the nerves that fluttered in my stomach. Upon arrival, I spotted his car parked on the corner. Professor Garcia was waiting for me inside. I approached, and he opened the door from within. Hello, Daniela. Get in, he said with a smile that made me uneasy. I entered the car, and we exchanged glances for a moment. There was tension in the air, an anticipation that couldn't be ignored. I knew what I was getting myself into, but I was committed to my plan. Thank you for this, I said, attempting to sound composed. He nodded and started the car. No problem, Daniela. I'm here to help you, he replied, his tone carrying something more. The drive was filled with a subtle tension. We discussed academic matters, but both of us were aware that there was an underlying conversation taking place. We arrived at his house, and I followed him inside, trying to exude confidence. It was my first time in his personal space, and it felt unfamiliar. We settled in the living room and sat down on the couch. Professor Garcia began explaining concepts that I had struggled to grasp in class. It was evident that he was knowledgeable, but there was something in his eyes that hinted at more. As we continued discussing academics, the innuendos persisted. I couldn't resist playing along, responding to his comments with double entendres. The tension continued to build, and we both knew we were crossing boundaries we shouldn't have. Finally, Professor Garcia ceased discussing academics and leaned closer. "Daniela, I'm here to assist you with whatever you need, not just in your studies," he said in a soft yet intentionally charged voice. My thoughts raced as I took a breath, attempting to process the situation. It was clear that we were crossing a line, venturing down a path from which there was no return. But I was determined to proceed, to follow through with my plan. "I genuinely appreciate your help, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to improve my grades," I said, my words laden with innuendo. He smiled, and his gaze grew more intense. "Daniela, sometimes things become complicated, but we can also find ways to simplify them," he said, his smile suggestive. She knew what he was implying, and she was willing to exploit the situation. "I agree, Professor. It's always better to find more efficient ways to achieve our goals," I replied, my voice filled with complicity. The tension became palpable, and we both knew we were about to cross a line we shouldn't have. However, the intensity of our desires overwhelmed any sense of guilt or logic, propelling us towards a mutual surrender to the temptation we had created. Guilt and rationality dissipated in that moment, replaced by a shared surrender to the forbidden. Although I had never been with someone older, I found pleasure in that moment, recognizing Professor Garcia's experience. After that encounter, everything changed. Classes became a dangerous game of stolen glances and secret messages. Whenever we were in close proximity, I could feel his provocative gaze upon me. Despite maintaining a facade of normalcy in front of others, I carried a burden of guilt for betraying my boyfriend, even if it was solely to improve my grades. When I returned to our apartment that night, I tried to hide my inner turmoil and act as if nothing had happened. I greeted my boyfriend as if everything were normal, while inside, I knew the truth of what I had done. Eventually, Professor Garcia mentioned that he was considering raising my grades. His words were laced with provocation, but I understood his true intentions. He had obtained what he desired, and I remained entangled in this complicity with my teacher, a situation of my own making. Although I had achieved what I wanted, I had no intention of continuing to see him. I had only engaged in this relationship to improve my grades, and now I decided to put an end to it. There were no arguments, no broken promises, I simply distanced myself. Our chance encounter remained in the past, concealed in the shadows. The situation, however, remained tense. Every time I had an interaction with Professor Garcia in class, I could feel his gaze upon me, and I knew that my face betrayed traces of our shared intimacy. Even though I had closed that door, the memory of our encounter remained a complicated part of my story. My boyfriend continued to stand by my side, oblivious to the secrets I carried. Our relationship continued as usual, and every smile, every loving gesture, carried a weight that only I knew. I had never cheated on my boyfriend, so I had to grapple with the memories I shared with Professor Garcia. Days turned into weeks, and the semester progressed. Although things seemed to have returned to normal on the surface, the complicity that had developed between Professor Garcia and me never completely dissipated. Every time I encountered him, I could sense a lingering remembrance of what we had shared. However, despite occasional meaningful glances, our interactions gradually returned to normal. I had decided to leave behind that clandestine and dangerous part of our relationship, focusing solely on the teacher-student dynamic. Although the significant glances had diminished, there were still fleeting moments when we reminisced about our shared intimacy. At times, I found myself thinking about the couch where I had engaged in a sexual encounter with my professor, conflicting emotions washing over me. On one hand, I felt a pang of regret, but on the other, a spark of excitement at the audacity of my actions. It wasn't an easy decision, and to be honest, it's not something I'm proud of. As time passed and my grades improved, I found myself torn between the satisfaction of achieving my goals and the guilt that gnawed at my conscience. No one else knew what had transpired between Professor Garcia and me, and I intended to keep it that way. I confided in no one about our clandestine meeting. It was a secret I carried alone, a burden weighing heavily on my shoulders. However, despite everything, a part of me felt grateful for the opportunity that had presented itself. My grades had improved, and with them, my academic future appeared more promising. Although I had achieved what I wanted, I had no intention of continuing my encounters with Professor Garcia. Our story remained in that dark and complicated chapter of my life, a chapter one preferred to keep closed and buried in the past. Classes continued, the university progressed, and my relationship with my boyfriend remained intact. Although the situation with Professor Garcia was behind me, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt whenever I looked at my boyfriend. He had been there for me from the beginning, supporting me in my studies and every step I took. He didn't deserve the lies and secrets I harbored. Over time, guilt began to eat away at my conscience. I cherished my boyfriend and was grateful for his unwavering support. He had no inkling of what had transpired, and honestly, I didn't know how he would react if he discovered the truth. I kept telling myself that what I had done was in pursuit of a better future, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had betrayed the trust he placed in me. In my mind, my boyfriend remained the pillar of my life, always providing unwavering support. He had always been there for me, and he would never forgive me if he discovered what had happened. I wanted to be better, for him and for myself. I wanted to leave my mistakes behind and build a solid future.